Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Mindflow's monthly webinar series. My name is Anthony Ferrano, and today we are joined by one of our very own providers, Dr. Bonita, where we're going to talk about perfectionism. As many of you know, it is an incredibly prevalent trait within college athletics. So we want to be able to harness that trait for the better and not let it become detrimental. One thing I will note before passing off to Dr. Bonita, is that we have a Q&A session at the end of each webinar. So if you have a question, please feel free to submit it. You'll see a Q&A emblem on your screen. You can submit those at any point during today's session, and we'll make sure they get addressed at the end. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Dr. Bonita.
All right, thanks, Anthony. So welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about perfectionism in college athletics, how it shapes your experience both on and off the field, court, or track. We'll talk a little bit about a couple different types of therapies, different tools, and practical ways to manage high standards without feeling like you're getting stuck in the stress or in the anxiety that they can create. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of how to strive for excellence with more resilience, confidence, and enjoyment in what you're doing. So to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about today, we'll start off talking about how to identify helpful versus unhelpful perfectionism, reducing the fear of failure, and then our second half of the presentation will be more about those tools that you can use. So reframing self-critical beliefs using principles from cognitive behavioral therapy, and then also using some other tools for exposure and self-compassion. So let's start off just talking about how do we identify helpful versus unhelpful perfectionism. So according to researchers like Hewitt and Flett, perfectionism often comes with an intense fear of failure and self-criticism. It's one thing to aim high, but it's another thing to feel devastated by anything short of flawless. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do you distinguish between the two. So let's first start off by defining perfectionism. At its core, perfectionism is the relentless pursuit of flawlessness and setting exceedingly high standards for ourselves. So standards that can be unrealistic and impossible to achieve. Perfectionism can manifest in many different areas of our lives. So we're talking about athletics today, but it could really be about academics, personal relationships, work. And it's not just about striving for success, it's about fearing failure. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between that kind of approach mindset where you're trying to work towards something versus that running away mindset where you're trying to run away from something that you don't want to happen. So it's about when we're talking about kind of this negative or unhelpful side of perfectionism, it's about that fear of failure, needing to avoid mistakes at all costs. You can kind of see how this fear can lead to negative self-talk, anxiety, and a sense of inadequacy if high standards aren't met. So what we really want to make sure is we're understanding perfectionism, and understanding it is the key to recognizing how it impacts our actions, our emotions, our overall well-being. And so we can start thinking about how do we distinguish between that healthy level of perfectionism and how that shapes our experience. Okay, so healthy striving might look like challenging yourself to improve your free throw percentage over time. Unhelpful perfectionism is different. It's telling yourself, if I don't sink every shot, then I'm a failure. Right? So this distinction here is really important and it really matters. So studies have shown that athletes with more adaptive, flexible perfectionism actually maintain better focus and motivation, while rigid perfectionists are more prone to anxiety and performance slumps. So we're really looking at here is the ability to be psychologically flexible. That's the core. Can we look at things like as they're happening rather than from as they're happening to us? So if you look at the difference between what we have on the left versus right, under unhelpful perfectionism, we have high standards that are motivating. So, having high standards isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be super motivating if you set goals for yourself or if you're striving towards something, and that you are motivated to do those things. Helpful perfectionism is also focusing on your progress, your effort, your growth. It's really looking at your process here. helpful perfectionism is about yourself. It's not necessarily about anybody else, it's about you, right? It's you comparing yourself to yourself. Am I better today than I was yesterday, last year, 2 seasons ago? Right? We're really trying to think about how do you compare yourself to yourself. And the last part is it's flexible, right? You're looking at things without always kind of picking or sticking to that first thought that shows up for you. You're able to look at it in a more dynamic way. You can incorporate different types of feedback or look at it in a more flexible way, looking at different perspectives. So you're not just focused on that first thought that your mind sticks to. On the right side, we have unhelpful perfectionism. So these are the qualities associated with that. So there's a fear of mistakes, there's procrastination that shows up, and often it's self-criticism, right? So it's not necessarily motivating. The way you're talking to yourself when you're being unhelpfully perfectionistic, it's not always in the nicest way. It's a lot of it is based on focus on unattainable outcomes and standards, where you're really focusing more on that outcome, what's going to happen. It could be unrealistic. Sometimes it is realistic, but it's mainly so focused on the outcome, you're not looking at the process. Unhelpful perfectionism is often about others. So you're really comparing yourself about what are other people around the room doing, not focused on yourself. You're trying to compare yourself against the other people, and that can be demoralizing at times when you're not meeting that standard. And then lastly, it's rigid. So you're really just whatever first thought shows up in your mind, that's the one that you're stuck to, and it's very hard to take different types of perspectives. So to give you like an example here, an unhelpful perfectionistic thought could be, I want to give 100% effort during practice today. Unhelpful would be, if I don't hit a PR today, I'm a failure. So you can kind of see the difference between these two. One is more focused on effort, it's motivating, it's focused on growth, it's focused on yourself. Whereas the second one is not motivating, it's self-critical, and it's rigid, right? It's an all or nothing sort of statement. So healthy perfectionism is about striving for excellence without placing those unrealistic or overly critical demands on yourself. So we're really trying to make it more about the process. So understanding these differences is crucial because healthy perfectionism helps you perform at your best without self-criticism, while unhealthy perfectionism can hold you back and lead to negative feelings about your abilities. So let's understand and explore a little bit more about why that fear of failure is so big, and understanding the why can help us challenge it. So, one of the biggest reasons, quite simply, is the pressure to perform, right? So, whether it's in academics, athletics, life, for many of us, there's a constant expectation to excel, to be better, right? To meet these high standards, always deliver our best. And this pressure can come from coaches, from teachers, your parents, even yourselves. There could be external reasons why it's important for you to stay, at that level that you're performing at. And underneath that pressure is often a false belief that if I fail, it means I'm not good enough. So, the important thing about this statement is that you're linking your mistakes to your worth. So, you're thinking about failure and thinking that failure defines who we are as a person or as an athlete. But the truth is that failure doesn't mean you're not good enough. It's just an experience, right? It's not a reflection of your value. So when you start trying to internalize and, whatever your actions are in the world, you start making it about who you are as a person. That's where this kind of negativity can start. What we want to do is really stay focused on your values, purpose, goals, process, even if you didn't get the outcome that you want. Right. So it's not necessarily that just because the outcome didn't happen, that means there's something wrong with me as a person. Right. Trying to separate those two things. And the impact of this is pretty significant. So if we fear failure, if we start thinking about failure as a reflection of who we are, it leads to procrastination, right? Like putting off tasks to avoid the possibility of failing. Putting off, you can think about if somebody works with a lot of people that have a lot of test anxiety, if you are afraid of, failing a test, you end up putting it off, putting it off, putting it off, right? Um, it can also cause avoidance, like skipping opportunities or challenges where you might not succeed. So if there's things that you might want to try, but you're afraid that you might not be good at it, you might end up putting those opportunities off or not even attending them at all. And over time, this fear driven cycle leads to burnout. So you feel exhausted, unmotivated, and stuck because you're always trying to avoid imperfection. So when we believe failure equals I'm not good enough, it's like carrying this heavy weight and it's going to hold you back, right? But the reality is, failure is not a judgment. What we really need to do is start treating failure as feedback. So, learning to challenge this fear can help us face new challenges, take risks, and grow stronger both on and off the field. So, a little quote down here: fear of failure doesn't prevent mistakes, it prevents growth. Failure is feedback, not a measure of your worth. And that's really the point that we want to drive home today. That we're using it as feedback, we're using it as helpful information, not shying away from it. So, reframing failure as feedback. So, like we were saying, failure is part of growth and mastery. Every athlete, no matter how talented, has experienced setbacks, right? Like, there's no way about it. Every person, no matter how talented, has experienced setbacks. It's how your skills are built. Mistakes show us what to work on and give us valuable feedback. Without these challenges, we wouldn't know where to grow, right? We wouldn't know what parts we need to practice more. The second part of this is failure is subjective. So it's really about how you might define it. You might call a missed shot or a lost game as a failure, but someone else might see it as progress or practice. What matters isn't the event itself, but the meaning we give to it. And that's super important here. When we let go of some of that meaning, when we kind of create some separation between how we view ourselves versus how we view the event, then we have more space from which we can look at what happened and analyze it, and actually learn and grow from it. But if we get really stuck in looking at what happened and over identifying with it, then it's much more difficult for us to look at it as feedback. Most importantly, failure isn't defining. Right? Missing a goal, stumbling in a competition, not performing perfectly, it doesn't define who you are as an athlete or a person. Your worth doesn't depend on a single outcome. Really, what matters or what's important here is how you respond, how you learn to adapt and keep going. So instead of thinking I failed, we want to reframe that to thinking that this was feedback, right? What can I take away from this experience to improve? So we're trying to look at failure as a tool for growth rather than a dead end, because that's where you become more resilient and better prepared for the challenges ahead. Remember, even the greatest athletes in the world succeed because they failed, and they failed a lot, and they failed over and over again, and they learn from these experiences. So growth doesn't happen in perfection, it happens in the process here. So I want to take a moment here, just give you a second to pause and reflect with a short activity to help you identify how fear of failure might be showing up in your life. So I want you to just take a moment here. Think about a recent time when you avoided doing something because you were afraid of failing. So this could be skipping a difficult workout, procrastinating on a big project. I know many of you might have had finals recently, so maybe procrastinating on studying, avoiding a conversation that might have been difficult, avoiding an opportunity, anything that you kind of skipped out on because you were afraid that you weren't going to be good enough. And I want you to write it down. What did you avoid doing? And what were you afraid might happen if you failed? And once you write that down, reflect on this. What did you learn, or what could you have learned from that experience? So, for example, maybe avoiding that opportunity helped you realize how much pressure you put on yourself. Or maybe it showed you that even when you're unsure, taking that first step could have been valuable. Right? So, there's a lot that we can learn from these experiences when we tend to avoid. We're not actually giving ourselves the opportunity to try. And so I think that's important to kind of think about when in your life do you feel like you tend um, to drop out of. Okay. So next we're going to go into some of these tools. So we're going to start off by how to reframe some of these self-critical beliefs. So we talked a little bit about reframing failure. Let's talk about just kind of generally, how do we reframe our beliefs? So the framework we're going to start off by using is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is a pretty common therapy that you might have heard of in your psych classes. But CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, really focuses on how thoughts affect feelings and behaviors. So you can kind of see how all of these are interconnected, right? Our thoughts, our feelings, sensations, and our behaviors. And at the core of CBT is this idea that if we can challenge our unhelpful thoughts, look at them in a different way, we can reduce anxiety and perfectionism, and we can do more of what's important to us. We'll have more freedom and flexibility to do the stuff that's important. So CBT really helps us understand that how we think influences how we feel and we behave. So if we think I have to be flawless or I'm nothing, we'll feel anxious and behave in ways that confirm that fear, like avoiding competition or overtraining. So CBT offers a way for us to test these beliefs and reframe them more productively. So in sports, we use CBT a lot to help athletes kind of reframe things as they're happening, both in the moment and also off the field. How are you reframing and thinking about these things differently? How do you manage your feelings, your internal sensations as they show up? And how do you act in ways that are more consistent with your values? Do the stuff that's important to you, even when you have unhelpful thoughts, even when you're feeling anxious or having jitters. How do you reframe the way you think to still focus on that behavior? So a big first step here is noticing that inner dialogue that's running in the background. And this is where the first step is noticing what you're thinking, right? And from there, we're looking at in some ways in which your thoughts might be distorted. So cognitive distortions are patterns of unhelpful, exaggerated, or irrational thinking that increases stress and perfectionism. So you can think about this as, somebody using words like must, have to, or never. Things like I must never miss a penalty kick. Recognizing these patterns lets you challenge them, right? So that's a common one. Other ones are all or nothing thinking. If I'm not the best, I'm a failure. It's really black or white. That there's only two possible outcomes: that either you are doing the best or you failed. Catastrophizing is when you're kind of taking a small event and making it a lot bigger. If I mess up, I'll ruin my entire season. Overgeneralizing, one bad game means I'm a terrible athlete. So taking one experience and saying that is a reflection of you as a person, as an athlete, or even just across your full season. And then mind reading is trying to think that you know what other people are thinking about you. So if you make a mistake, my coach thinks I'm not good enough, or really thinking that you can read what the other person is trying to say, even if they haven't said anything. So recognizing these patterns allows you to challenge them. So what we want to do is focus on how do you identify and name these distortions. And over time, that helps decrease their power, right? So these common distortions, I put these down because these are the most common ones in athletes, but in reality, this is a very common way. Everybody is thinking this way. We fall into these patterns because we're really just trying to better understand the world around us. But the problem is sometimes our thinking doesn't actually line up with what's happening, or we're focused too much on one part of the story rather than looking at the full big picture. So these thoughts feel really real in the moment, but they're rarely true. So we want to identify and challenge these distortions and start shifting our mindset and approach challenges with more balance and self-compassion. Okay, so let's figure out how do we challenge and reframe this self-talk. So once you've identified a perfectionistic talk, so once you're getting better at kind of doing that internal scan, understanding the way your thoughts are flowing, understanding the thinking traps, the distortions that your mind tends to fall into. What we want to do is start practicing reframing it. So instead of this thought of I have to be perfect today or I'm a failure, You want to say something like, I want to do my best, and any mistake will teach me something new. Right. And so I gave you, this is one of my favorite ways of looking at it in a really quick way. Catch it, check it, change it. Catch it is just noticing the self-critical thought is even there, right? So a lot of times we're being really harsh or self-critical without even noticing it. So the catch it is really just thinking about how are you pausing, allowing the thought to be there, and just catching it, noticing that it's happening. From there, you want to check it. The easiest questions to ask yourself, is this thought helpful? Is it accurate? Is it fair? If it's none of those things, then we want to make sure we're giving ourselves space to change it, right? So reframing it with a more balanced, growth-oriented statement. So can you take a step back? Can you look at this thought more critically? And can you see where maybe you're falling into one of these distortions, and can you correct it? So on the example I gave at the bottom, if the original thought is something like, I'm terrible at this, or I'm never going to get this right, um, if you catch it, ask yourself, is this fair? Is it accurate? Is it helpful? Are there times when I have been good at it? Are there parts of what I'm doing that I'm actually getting and there's something else that I'm missing? Is this an all or nothing statement where I'm either terrible or I'm good, when in reality there's more of a gray area in there? And is this helpful? Is thinking I'm terrible at this actually helping me execute better? If all of that is no, then we want to see if we can change it. Can we look at it in a more balanced way, more in line with what's actually happening? Right. So in this case, you can reframe to, I'm still learning and progress takes time. Okay. So, again, putting it all together, our first step is just noticing that inner dialogue running in the background, and then figuring out how do we check it, see what is happening in our mind, and then how do we change it. So giving you a couple examples in that all or nothing thinking. If the thought is, if I don't win, I'm a failure. If you were to check that thought, it sounds like an all or nothing thought, right? If I don't win, I'm a failure. There's only two options here. And the reframe here, the challenge would be, one game doesn't define my abilities. I can learn and improve. In that catastrophizing example, the thought here is, if I make a mistake, everyone will lose trust in me. Um, and I think this might actually also be a little bit of mind reading too, that you're trying to anticipate what other people might be thinking about you. Again, is this helpful? Probably not. Is it accurate? I can't tell, right? I don't know unless I actually talk to everybody and see. Um, and is it fair? Is it fair for me to believe that everybody's going to lose trust in me? Probably not, right? So here we want to change it to, one mistake doesn't erase my hard work or skills, right? One mistake doesn't cause you to lose trust in everybody around you, especially your teammates that know you the best, probably. Okay, so now we're going to move on to just giving you a couple other tools, and we'll talk a little bit about using exposures and then also self-compassion. So one of the tools that I use quite a bit in my practice is called exposure with response prevention. So this is a proven evidence-based approach that helps reduce anxiety and fear by breaking the cycle of avoidance and compulsive behaviors. So classically, ERP was created for OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, which is where people have intrusive thoughts that feel really sticky, cause a lot of distress, and then you do something to make that thought go away or make that distress go away, right? Um, but in simple terms, when we're trying to apply it to perfectionism, we're really trying to reduce that like instinct to avoid or fix the discomfort with certain behaviors. We're really just trying to allow ourselves to become more comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, allowing ourselves to feel the distress. And I added this curve up here. This is the inverted U curve that you might have seen before when thinking about performance. And I find this super helpful when thinking about perfectionism, because here, what we're showing here on the bottom says arousal, but really you can think about it as perfectionism or perfectionistic anxiety. On the Y curve, we have performance. And you can see that kind of at the bottom, if you have less perfectionistic thoughts, your performance isn't going to be the best, right? If you don't really care about a situation, if you're not trying to strive towards better, your performance is not going to be as good. Over time, there's this kind of sweet spot here at the top where you are focusing on improving, getting things right, kind of tweaking your method, and your performance is going to kind of reach this peak. But what's interesting is that it's not necessarily that more perfectionism creates better results all the time. And you can see how, as this perfectionistic anxiety gets bigger and bigger and reaches this high level, performance tanks. So at this end, we can start seeing that because of that strong anxiety and pressure that you're putting on yourself, it's no longer helpful, it's no longer adaptive. So in this type of exposure therapy, what we're really trying to do is tolerate the distress in this end of the spectrum so that as that anxiety is continuing, can we find ways to mitigate it and focus more on the process? So, especially in these lower stakes, helping you approach experiences that might cause you some distress and get more comfortable with feeling that distress. Because what we know is when we get to this higher level of distress, our performance is gonna start having taking that hit, right? So we want to try to find ways to reduce this amount of distress, this amount of anxiety. So ERP works to interrupt this cycle by gradually facing the thought situations or emotions that you might typically avoid. So this is the exposure part. At the same time, we resist our usual responses like overcorrecting when there's diminishing returns or checking repeatedly. And this is the response part. So over time, our brain learns that the anxiety will lessen on its own and that discomfort doesn't always mean danger. So in short, we become more comfortable being uncomfortable. So if you think about it, perfectionism, especially unhealthy perfectionism, is really this dislike of wanting to be uncomfortable. The discomfort that comes along with not being perfect. So what we want to do is tolerate that distress, be better at being okay with that, and that helps you focus more on the process. So, kind of giving you some examples that kind of helps you put this into practice. You want to start small and build gradually when you're practicing exposures, identifying situations, tasks, or thoughts you avoid due to perfectionism, and begin with small challenges and work your way up as your tolerance grows. So it's all about intentionally facing situations that trigger discomfort and resisting the urge to fix, avoid, or over control. So, things that you could do during practice, allow for small imperfections. So, missing a shot or making a mistake, challenging the belief that everything must be perfect, um, resisting safety behaviors. So a lot of times when you think about wanting to tolerate the distress, sometimes it's the distress of what other people might think about you. So resisting safety behaviors like asking your coach or teammates for reassurance after a mistake or overly apologizing. So this helps you build that confidence without relying on external validation. Another approach is using time limits, so only working for a specific amount of time and then stopping when the timer goes off, even if it feels incomplete. This prevents perfection-driven overworking. So, if you go back to the slide, thinking about how only your performance is only good for a certain amount of time as you start getting more anxious. Your performance likely won't be as good at this higher level. So that's this idea of limiting the amount of time that you're working on something to make sure that you're not working when there's diminishing returns. And then lastly is just challenging over preparation. So limit the time you spend mentally rehearsing a play or obsessing over game day scenarios. So it's about getting comfortable with good enough so you can focus on your performance rather than perfection. So the more you practice these exposures, the more you'll see that discomfort doesn't last forever and that the mistakes are part of your growth. Okay, so as we're thinking about bringing this all together, can we practice these exposures with some of those cognitive behavioral reframing? And they actually work really well together to challenge perfection. So let's say you're afraid of making a mistake in practice and you think if I mess up, everyone will lose trust in me. ERP helps you stay in that uncomfortable moment. So maybe you keep practicing without stopping to fix every error. Instead of avoiding the mistake, you face it and allow yourself to feel the discomfort. At the same time, you're challenging the thought that's behind it. So asking yourself, is this really true? Would one mistake really cause everyone to lose trust in me? Probably not. So you can reframe it to something a little bit more balanced, like mistakes are part of the improvement, and this is an opportunity to grow, right? So you can use those three C's that catch it, check it, change it to challenge your thinking, and then also practice tolerating that distress, discomfort when these thoughts show up. So the more that you practice these two things together, the exposure, allowing yourself to feel that uncomfortability paired with that reframed mindset, with the reframing, the less power that unhealthy side of perfectionism will have over you. So over time, you can build that resilience, perform more freely, and focus on progress rather than perfection. Okay, so I wanted to talk at the end a little bit too about self-compassion because I think when we boil perfectionism down, what it really comes down to is self-criticism. And the most powerful antidote to self-criticism is self-compassion. So treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you'd offer a close friend or a teammate. So in my practice, I do this a lot with my athletes or with people I work with. How can you now flip that script of what you're saying to yourself? Now flip it and say it to your best friend, right? So treat yourself like a teammate. What would I say to a friend or teammate who made this mistake? Would you use the same voice, the same tone, the same like angry words that you are using for yourself? No, you'd probably respond with encouragement, not criticism, right? So when we think about enhancing self-compassion, it's not necessarily like being super, super nice to ourselves or letting ourselves off the hook. If you like hurt somebody or something like that. It's just offering the same kindness that you would offer somebody else. Because that's the hardest part is just being nice to yourself in the way that you would be to somebody else. It's also helpful to normalize mistakes, right? So reminding yourself that everyone, no matter how skilled, makes errors. Mistakes don't define your worth. They're opportunities to learn and improve. So really thinking about mistakes as a natural part of the process. Um, the third part is focusing on progress, not perfection. Asking yourself, what did I learn? How can I grow from this? Reframing from shame to growth. And the last part of self compassion here is mindful awareness. So, noticing when self critical thoughts start showing up, pausing and doing your reframes of, I'm doing my best right now, and that's enough. Right. So, noticing really in the moment when you are being self critical is one of the most powerful things you can do to flip that script and start using more compassionate words towards yourself. So self-compassion is not about lowering your standards. It's about supporting yourself through challenges so you can thrive. A lot of times I like to think about it as you made the mistake or you didn't kind of perform as well as you wanted to. Self-compassion is not about like forgetting the fact that you did what you did. It's about not adding on, layering on more hurt and more kind of bad feelings. What you're trying to do is just feel what it is that, experience the experience for what happened without layering on more. And then kind of thinking about how you can reframe and progress into the future. So I wanted to end with, I think, a quote that really kind of brings all of this together from Michael Jordan. I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to make the game's winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed. Right. And so, this idea here is that no matter how many times you miss, it's about getting back up and doing it again. Right. And that's where success happens. And so, when we're able to let go of those unhelpful parts of perfectionism and just know that making mistakes is part of the process, we're able to do so much more. All right. So now I think Anthony will start doing our Q&A if anybody
Yeah.
has questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Bonita. Thank you for all of this, by the way. This has been an incredible presentation. I know a lot of people out there are going to take a lot of these tools and use them starting today. So kudos to you, Dr. Bonita. We got a couple good ones. And again, I encourage you all to submit some questions if you got them. Chances are somebody else in this webinar also has the same questions. So we'll start off with, how can I still be competitive if I realize I can't be perfect?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, nobody can be perfect, right? And so that's the mindset shift that we're thinking about is we're not trying to lose the edge by letting go of the um unhelpful perfectionism. And that's really why I wanted to spend so much time distinguishing helpful versus unhelpful. And this is not about letting go of that helpful side. You want to keep that edge. You want to keep striving. You want to keep that grit. But can you let go of that self-critical part of it, where that self-critical part is not necessarily helpful? It's actually adding on more pain rather than just allowing you to see the experience for what it is and learning from it and giving yourself space to really examine it without adding on that additional layer of, hurt or discomfort or anxiety.
Absolutely. Well said. Got a good one here. In the heat of the moment, say for instance, in a game, how can you quickly get out of that perfectionist mindset? A quick reset. Maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think this is something that's really helpful to work with a sports psychologist or somebody to figure out what works for you. But I think generally what you want to do is see what you can do to just pause and reset. And so you're not necessarily going to go through one of these full skills. These are more for after the fact when you're sitting there, after the game, kind of reviewing, what you did and what you could have done differently. In the moment, all you want to do is pause, reset, and focus on mindfulness. How can you stay in the present moment? So, different athletes have different ways of doing this, but you can pick some sort of cue that will keep you focused on the present moment. So, people use like hand gestures, a quick deep breath, things like that that can help you pause, recenter, kind of shake off what just happened. And then from there, moving forward, that's all that matters. So whatever happened, happened. Use your pause, use your reset, and focus on everything going forward.
That's great. Yep. I know all athletes can use that. So thank you for the question as well. Got another really good one. If you are avoiding an activity, how do
Mhm.
you distinguish the reason between potential burnout or depression and actual perfectionism? Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're doing an activity, how do you distinguish anxiety versus perfectionism? I think it's really about what is ultimately, what's the function of the behavior? So, and is it because you aren't enjoying it anymore? Is it because you're too anxious to do it anymore? Is it because you're afraid that you're going to do it and mess up? So really think about your why. So why does this feel so heavy for me right now? Why does this feel like I don't really want to do it? It could be, one of those things. It could be all three of those things. But whenever there's things that you don't necessarily, that feels different than what you normally would do, right? So like if you usually have no problem getting up and getting yourself to practice or getting yourself to class, and for some reason it's not happening right now, really think about what has changed and why. What is holding you back? What's the fear telling you? Is it the fear of failure? Is it the fear of messing up? Is it just you're feeling anxious, you're feeling tired? And then from there you can think about how to challenge it and do something different.
All right, moving on to the next. How do you balance self-compassion with constructive criticism, knowing that sometimes athletes need to have a difficult conversation about their effort or performance that could be hindering their growth?
Yeah, I love that question. I work on this all day long with a lot of my clients. So the main difference between self-compassion and self-critical thoughts, or even critical thoughts that focus on, that may not be compassionate, is how you are talking to yourself. So yeah, is the criticism focused on growth or is it focused on punishment? Because I've worked with a lot of athletes where they have this belief that in order for me to grow, I have to punish myself. I have to be really negative towards myself, otherwise I'm not going to grow. And that's a false belief, because there's ways in which you can examine the behavior and focus on how to do it differently next time without using all of that negative language towards yourself. So focus on the words you're using, the tone you're using. Is it harsh? Is it punitive? Is it angry? How do you feel in your body? Are you like hunched up? Are you like, are you tense? Are you using that kind of like physical posturing? Those are things that we don't need to do when we're just examining our behavior and trying to do things differently. Those are things that actually make the situation a lot worse, because then we start internalizing the mistake rather than just seeing it more objectively. And when you're able to see the mistake just as it is without assigning blame or meaning or shame to it, you have a lot more flexibility of doing something differently next time. And that's what's cool about it, because then, you know, if you let go of that, you have so much more that you can do with your thoughts and so much more like potential here. But yeah, it's a really good question, because there's obviously we don't want to not examine, like we want to examine where we fall short or what we could have done differently next time. But it's about focusing on the next time and not going back and kind of beating ourselves up for the last time.
Great question. And well said. We've got one final one, unless someone else wants to throw in a buzzer beater. But it's a good question that is going to send us off and allow us to move forward and carry this mindset um, into the future. So, what are some common pitfalls people may fall into when trying to let go of perfectionism?
I think a lot of times people think that they'll lose their edge if they let go of perfectionism. And I think, the reason why I included that like U curve is because at some point there are diminishing returns with perfectionism, right? So if you think about like if you're writing a paper and you've written it for like, I don't know, 15 hours, and you wrote the whole thing, it's all done. If you're going back and reviewing it, maybe you can find a couple more mistakes after like 16th hour. 17th hour, maybe there's one mistake. 18th hour, there's really nothing more that you can really refine to improve. And redefining perfectionism is really about noticing when you've hit that wall where you're not going to improve anymore by focusing more on the outcome. At that point, you want to focus on the process. So that's where we want to think about that difference of when you hit that wall, when you've already done the best that you can do, are you spending time kind of continuing to ruminate where you're actually going to cause yourself more harm? And so working with somebody to think about where that wall is for you, because it's different for everybody. And then what can you do differently in those moments rather than trying to ruminate or kind of replay certain things in your mind? What are other things you can do that are going to be more helpful in these moments?
Great. One final housekeeping item I'm going to throw out there before passing it off to Dr. Bonita, sir, to give her closing remarks. This will be recorded. And so what we're going to do is I'll send this link with the recording to each one of you who attended. Feel free to rewatch it, share it with any individual you think could benefit. But thank you all for being here. Happy holidays. But I'll pass it off to Dr. Bonita to give her closing remarks after what a great presentation she gave.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, just in closing, if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out. I have my email address down there, but I'm really excited to talk about this. It's an area that I'm really passionate about, because I think it's something that we get really stuck and hung up on, this idea that we have to be perfect in order to be better. When in reality, there's a lot other ways to be better that are much more kinder to ourselves. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. And if there's any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to talk.
All right, everyone. We'll see y'all next month. Be well.
Bye.